With AMD seemingly dominating the CPU market at the moment, it got me wondering. We all know their AMD FX line was a bit of a flop, but at the time people really looked fondly on the older Phenom chips. So just how are they holding up in 2025? Right, so a little while ago we bought this Asus gaming PC for quite cheap off eBay, and it was mostly quite a disappointment. I mean, it had an interesting graphics card in it that we got somewhat of an interesting video off, but it does have an AMD Phenom chip in it. I think it's a Phenom II chip, and it got me wondering. I've had it sitting around in the corner, I have no idea what I want to do with this, but is it worth actually using an old AMD Phenom system, because no one talks about them. So inside here, what we've actually got is a proper, somewhat okay Phenom system. I mean, it's a nice motherboard. It's actually set up with an SSD already, but we never actually properly got to see what the processor in this was actually capable of. So why don't we try and whack a modern operating system on here and see what it can actually do. So I'm thinking, first of all, why don't we try and run maybe Windows 11 on here? So let's just double check it still boots real quick, because I remember this system being really funny about adding in graphics cards, so we're probably going to have to take out the octagen power supply because I don't trust it. But let's just make sure we get some sort of signal out of the system. Right, it still boots, that's fine, still turns on, that's nice to see. But I think I've got a Windows 11 SSD somewhere which is set up to work on older systems. Let's just rip an SSD out of this real quick. SSD, pinch my RAM back as well. So straight off the bat, what happens when we plug in a Windows 11 SSD? Looks like it's not very interested in doing anything at all. What we do want to do is give this thing the best chance it has of actually working. I suppose this is a good test for longevity's sake, is seeing if it'll run a modern operating system. Now, I don't think it will boot to the USB stick. I think we can get Windows 11 on here. We might just need to set up the USB stick differently. Let's have a go at that real quick. And then we've got Windows 11 selected here. And then if we set it to boot from MBR, which is a BIOS, this USB stick should boot on an old Phenom system, which could be 0.1 dealt with. All that's really left is, while that sets up, can we throw some extra parts in here to make this a little bit more usable? At the end of the day, this system does need upgrades, so let's give it a go. We'll try some extra RAM, and then I think we're going to need a new power supply. Usually these old AMD systems will pretty much take whatever RAM you throw at them, so I'm quite optimistic that will just boot up with the RAM that we've thrown in. 24 gigs of RAM, so 24 gigs running dual channel, that's a good amount of RAM to start off with, so RAM-wise, we're sorted. We are also running a Phenom II X4 955, which is a good chip, and on this board, we do actually have, but that power supply's got to go, because it needs a better graphics card. We were struggling to get it to support anything more than this HD 5670 that we whacked in here last time. So that's going. We don't want that. That's done for. That's nothing. We don't want it. Now this has actually been cable managed. It's not a bad case, this. It's very 2010s case. Oh, look at that adapter. That's a lovely extension there. I didn't realise I was jumping from a Molex to a SATA adapter onto an 8-pin. That's not a fire hazard. One off. They've done a nice job on cable management, to be fair, but unfortunately cable managing shite doesn't make it any better. Oh, there's another one. Joy. Right, well that's a worthless power supply I now own, but this is the reason I bought the R9 Nano. Flagship power, fits in any system. Now let's just double check that with a better power supply, will this actually boot a good graphics card? Well, now it doesn't turn on. Oh, let me diagnose this real quick. I'm not saying our problem is definitely down here, but it looks like it could be. So let's just recap. We've got an upgraded power supply, we've got better RAM, we've actually added a new graphics card. So if we turn it on, we should get a signal out of this graphics card, if all is going well. See, the beeps and lack of posting to me say that it doesn't like the graphics card, which is a very distinctly AM3 issue. Well, at least it's turning on now. Let's double check if there's a BIOS update, and maybe that's what it needs, because I'm gonna say that's probably what's going wrong. There is one from 2011 that improves system stability, supports new CPUs, and we need to put that on a USB stick. Flash this ROM. If I really hated this computer, I could just unplug it. Maybe I've been a little bit harsh so far because it's taken so long to get to this point already. But we're this close. So many problems, all caused by an out-of-date BIOS. I guarantee you that other issue would probably have been fixed by updating the BIOS. So you know what? Points for it working, minus points for it being this much of a pain in the ass. So, step 1. Can the Phenom run Windows 11? I'll rejoin you if this actually installs. After quite some time, it does finally seem that we are at the Windows 11 start screen. Now, I did have to go back and find the last compatible version that does work on these old AMD Phenom chips, but it is still supported until late 2026, so for all intents and purposes, this is the latest version of Windows 11 that will run on these old AMD Phenom systems. So for at least the next year, operating system wise, on the Windows side, they are still supported. And we should be all good to go. We just need to get some drivers and see how usable this type of Phenom system really is. After what seems like an eternity, we are finally at the Windows 11 launch screen. Bring up DXDiag just to prove it. AMD Phenom II X4 955 3.2 GHz. No display adapter. That fan is really ramping up a little bit now. It doesn't feel particularly hot. It's only running at about 51 degrees, so it's not exactly running hot. Get these downloaded. We're all here. The AMD Phenom is running, admittedly quite loudly, but we are running with drivers downloading, a modern operating system, and everything's checking out okay. It's just been a monumental pain to get to this point. But then again, if you are picking up an AMD Phenom system, like we did, these are the things you could run into. So despite taking an eternity to get to this point, actually running the latest version of Windows 11 on this machine took no time at all. We've made it to the desktop within 15 minutes of starting the installer, and everything seemed to be working rather speedily. I mean, don't get me wrong, you could definitely hear the fan ramping up in the background, and it did take a few minutes for the processor usage to stabilise, but at the end of the day, this was a rather competent quad-core processor back in the day. So actually going through and getting it all set up with programs, applications, going online, installing drivers, well, it does this absolutely fine. So I'd say for general usage already, well, provided your AMD Phenom system isn't like mine and was horrifically out of date and riddled with problems, then it seems like a good enough system that you can use just out of the box. So for your web browsing, you can already do that, your video playback, pretty much anything you'd expect a computer to do. Let's just get that out of the way. It seems to still be doing it absolutely fine, even on the latest version of Windows, and if you fancy making it a little bit quicker, well, you can disable real-time scanning from the antivirus. I wouldn't recommend doing it, but it did actually make the system noticeably quicker. Not as much of a difference as we saw on those older i3 chips, because of course we've got 4 cores here, so it's got more processing cores to actually spare, but out of the box, it does seem like already the AMD Phenom is off to a good start. You just have to ignore the 3 hours of troubleshooting that came up to this point. Now, when it comes to the specifications of the AMD Phenom series, we will eventually take a look back at the history and where they came from and how they progressed, but I'm going to be saving that for a proper video on the final 6-core variant. For today though, what does matter is we've got the Phenom II X4 955, which is the black edition, which just means you've got an unlocked multiplier so you can overclock easier. Most of these chips already overclock quite well, but this version was particularly designed for it, so don't worry, we will be dabbling with some of that later. It comes in based on the nabbed architecture, which is on the 45nm process, and has 4 cores at 3.2 GHz. It also comes with a rather nice amount of L3 cache at 6MB, and I remember this being quite the point of contention back in the day. We're talking about 10 years ago, when people were looking at the FM2 chips or buying an older Phenom system, because at the time these things cost about the same as they do now. The price has just been stuck for the last 10 years. And at least on these chips you did actually get L3 cache, something that was omitted from the entirety of the Phenom II lineup that was somewhat comparable in price at the time, at least on the used market. The main downsides though are the enormous 145 watt TDP, which explains the stupidly large stock cooler, and you also get no SSE4 or AVX support, which is going to be a major point of contention as people do talk about emulating these features, but as I found out later today, that emulation has been left in the past as requirements have grown and grown. It came out in mid-2009, and you can pick one of these up for about £12 or $15, which is a lot of money given that you can get a Core i5 that performs quite similar, if not better from my testing, for 20 pence. So they've clearly got some collector's value, and I'm hoping they've got some performance value as well. But of course, as I said, we would try and do some overclocking, but I'll be honest, when it comes to these chips, a lot of people took the laziest option with the overclocking features, which was the auto overclock. In my case, it wasn't actually just a standard shove a ton of voltage in and run the clocks up. This one has actually got predefined profiles for the clock speed you want depending on the processor you're using. So I just selected it to run at 3.8 GHz, and it booted and it wasn't shoving in a ton of voltage because it was absolutely fine on the stock cooler and temperatures remained pretty decent. In terms of single core performance, we jumped from 155 to 178. And in terms of multi-core, we jumped from 609 to 720, and that was using the CPU-Z benchmark. And you know I've done this properly because I've written it on the back of a receipt, and that's exactly what I'm reading off at the moment. So yes, when it comes to these processors, you're pretty much just expected to overclock for free performance. And that's something that continued with the AMD FX line, the Phenom II line, and it's not until Ryzen that auto-overclocks, so I suppose it does still do the same thing. You're just expected to overclock out of the box to see the performance you should really be getting. Now, we are testing things today in a hodgepodge Frankenstein build that was originally an Asus gaming PC we bought off eBay for next to nothing, but at least we're now finally getting some real use out of it. It does have an okay Asus motherboard in there, that's not going to be limiting us in any way, and we are running with two 8GB sticks of RAM and two 4GB sticks of RAM to give us 22GB in total, which is running at 1600 MHz in dual channel, because yes, you can do that. We are also going to be ensuring that we are entirely CPU bound, as always, by utilising the R9 Nano, which is why I bought this graphics card, because it is insanely powerful and works in virtually every system, other than the fact this one wanted to be funny about it. But the main thing people seem to be noting, at least when I polled you, is most people tended to think the Phenom is done for. It's completely useless for modern usage in 2025. I mean, the poll goes to reflect that quite a lot. Very few people actually said, you know what, this is still usable. But when it came to the comments, most people saying, well, it will be fine for general usage, it'll be fine for day-to-day, because even a Core 2 Duo is, and by that extension, they are right already. As we've seen, you can still boot into Windows 11, you can still use it as a computer, you can still get away with actually doing your day-to-day tasks on this system. But lots of people were noticing and complaining that it lacks instruction sets. And I thought, well, surely that can't be that bad, because we tested the first generation of Core i processors, and they're missing instruction sets, and most stuff still launches there. So, is there really a problem on these AMD Phenoms? Is the lack of SSE4 and AVX that much of a problem? Well, you're about to find out in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA 5 with the legacy version, running with very high settings and AMD CHS shadows. Now, most of the benchmarks you're going to be seeing today are done at 720p to ensure that we are CPU bottlenecked in all instances. I know it's a very boring point, but it just means that what you are seeing here is the maximum performance the processor can offer. And we did see a pretty decent experience, which is very much in line with how I remember GTA 5 running on a lot of these older AMD Phenom chips. Now, the overclock did help out with overall frame rate stability, but I wouldn't say it necessarily helped us achieve any higher frames overall. It just meant that the game seemed to run a little bit smoother. There weren't all too many problems other than occasionally issues streaming in asset data, but that's something that plagued a lot of these chips and also went on to plague the Phenom II series and even some of the AMD FX chips, at least some of these smaller core count ones. Unfortunately, you're going to be having no luck when it comes to the Enhanced Edition, as I spent well over 45 minutes trying to get it to launch with emulated instruction sets and bits and pieces like that, and it was just no dice. So unfortunately you will be stuck to the legacy version, but at least it'll run somewhat okay still in 2025. The one area that has got more intensive though, especially in the legacy version, is GTA Online, where changing the settings around didn't really help all too much with the frame rate, so we opted to keep them at the high settings with those AMD CHS shadows still. Now it will still be playable, but you're going to be seeing anything in and around 30 FPS, dropping below this slightly when there is lots going on. Now it's also worth noting that once again this is tested in a full lobby where the netcode sort of breaks and the game becomes ridiculously intensive for no reason, but the AMD Phenom did at least see full utilization, which was something that we don't always see when testing components. Now it's also worth noting that you could see it get a lot better than this in smaller lobbies, but generally most of the time you should be expecting around 30 FPS, which is still admirable for a chip from 2009. Just remember we are running it overclocked here, and in this instance, well, the moment you got rid of the overclock, you would be straying just under 30 FPS and the realms of playability. When it came to BeamNG, I thought, well, there's something that seems wrong here, as even with medium and high settings in 720p, which does put some load on the processor with the shadows and the effects going on, it did take an awfully long time to load in and just didn't seem to stabilize until I hit the insert key and returned us back to the start of the map, which mysteriously fixed this for some reason, and then the game played absolutely fine afterwards. It could be coincidence, but this seemed to work more than once. So when it comes to BeamNG, trying to force the game to reload everything in seems to fix this sort of hitching you have going on. Once that was out of the way though, the game would run between 55 and 65 FPS, with 1% lows down to 49 FPS. So it has some ridiculously long load times, but it will still run. Given that in 2025 there is absolutely no way to launch Counter-Strike 2 on these older processors, despite the fact I think they still might be able to have at least a decent crack at running them. Even with emulation I wasn't able to get it to launch, and I did try. I got close, but unfortunately we're going to be after testing the most intensive Source game I can find, which is Black Mesa running the Zen levels, which once again does look gorgeous and does have the limitation of only really utilising 2 cores for a lot of what's going on around you. This limitation really did show that the Phenom chips do struggle when it comes to single core performance, as we saw 56 FPS on average, but this could drop down to the high 30s when there was lots going on in these areas. Now it's worth noting that for a lot of the game you'll be seeing well over 80 FPS, seeing between 80 and 120 a lot of the time, but when you start getting to these final more intensive parts of the game, well, you are going to be seeing anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS, and that's about the way it'll stay until you finish the game. When it comes to Mount & Blade Bannerlord, it tends to be quite favourable on a lot of these older processors, but even then, with the large battle benchmark going on, it could still suffer and struggle on these older Phenom chips. Now, don't be wrong, for a lot of the early to mid-game, you'd be seeing well over 40 FPS and usually over 60 FPS, especially in a lot of those early battles. But when there's lots going on, especially when utilising higher settings, you will see some stuttering. Now, as the game went on, these stutters would disappear, but so would your frame rate, as it now hovers just below 30 FPS when there is tons going on. Now with lower settings you could push this slightly north of 30 FPS, but changing the settings around really didn't make the difference I thought it would. So Mount & Blade Bannerlord is still playable, but you are going to suffer a little bit in the later bits of the game. Now, you know I'm running out of games that'll actually launch on this chip when we're testing RimWorld, which is actually a really good CPU benchmark because it's not so much the frame rate we're looking at here as it is the tick rate of the game. Now, with a relatively medium-sized colony, we saw that the game would run absolutely fine on 1 and 2 times speed, pretty much staying to the tick rate you'd expect the game to run at. However, utilising the 3 and 4 times speed options, 4 times of course being unlimited, we saw that there was very little difference between that and 2 times speed. So it already shows that this old Phenom chip is struggling. Now, despite the updates to this game making it more multi-core friendly, I suppose you could say, with the later updates, especially with the pathfinding elements, well, even then, on these older Phenom chips, that single-core dependence for a lot of aspects really shines through, and the game is playable, but it's going to be slow. Seeing Hitman 3 just decide to launch and run perfectly fine was actually a nice surprise compared to how long I've spent trying to get most games just to run. It loaded fast and it worked perfectly fine, and for once the actual settings available, I mean it does make sense given the nature of the game and how much it's trying to simulate that lower settings would be easier on a processor, but it saw us go from 8 FPS with medium settings up to well over 60 FPS in both of the available benchmarks when it came to the CPU side performance. So Hitman 3 is playable, just even if you've got a decent graphics card like we've got here, you'll be stuck with lower settings, purely because the amount it's trying to simulate. I mean, this is more of a credit to Hitman 3 being this scalable low down and still running on such a limited processor when so much doesn't even want to launch. But yeah, I'd say Hitman 3, provided you're fine with these types of settings, will work perfectly okay. When it came to Fallout 4 though, I really wasn't expecting the most of things to go well, because this game, it never really performed well on the old AMD FX chips, which is where I'm basing my knowledge of these things. So when it came to the older Phenom chips, performance was about exactly where I expected it to be, hovering in and around 30 FPS. Now it did see good utilization, but settings didn't make too much of a difference here. You could drop things down to low and it would stop you straying just under 30 FPS, but it wouldn't sort out the frame pacing, which seemed to be a major problem. Capping the frame rate would help, it wasn't guaranteed to fix this, and in smaller and simpler areas, yes, you would see a higher frame rate than this. But Fallout 4 was just about playable, and it did launch, which is something that we have to give it credit for given how much also won't launch on this processor. In a mysterious turn of events though, Baldur's Gate 3 is a relatively new game that will launch and run somewhat okay on the AMD Phenom chips. I say somewhat okay because it actually launched and made it in-game. The actual performance was questionable at best. Despite a 31 FPS average, you'd see the game hovering around 22 FPS anytime you were in a larger room, or anytime there was multiple NPCs or it actually had to do AI calculations. These Phenom chips don't tend to do particularly well here, and unfortunately with the R9 Fury graphics card that's in here, which is one of the newer cards we can fit in this system, you are also limited to the Vulkan version of the game, not really running properly and mostly just crashing. So you're stuck with the CPU scaling of DirectX 11, and it ran, but it didn't run well. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, even with ultra settings in DirectX 10, it did return a fairly okay frame rate. It's also worth noting here that Crysis is notorious for just using 2 cores, as is most of the games from the era this Phenom is actually from, which goes to show that its weakness has always really been apparent. It sort of peaks in those early 2010s games that utilize 4 cores, and falls behind in games that utilize 2, and later games that need more than 4 cores, well, a lot of the time they won't start, and when they do, they won't run well. So Crysis is actually quite a good indicator of the Phenom's performance. It's always been okay, it's just never exactly been stellar, because, I mean, I've seen Core 2 Duos do better than this, and this is of course with an overclock. So yes, Crysis will work, but don't expect anything like extreme gaming performance. It'll get you by and that's about it. So overall performance. Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it was bad, as it certainly got by in a lot of titles, especially given that this is a 2009 processor, which is something I need to remind myself. It's just, after having looked at the Core i7, which is also from 2008, 2009-ish, well, that performed much better and is, if anything, a lot cheaper than these are today. Now, I understand the retro market has different swings and appeals, but even then, I'd rather use an i7 or an i5 than using the old Phenom chips. It's cool, don't get me wrong, and I do want to take a look at it in a retro sense at some point, but it suffers the same way that I saw the AMD FX series suffer. In earlier retro games, well, it can only utilize 2 cores, and the 2 cores we've got perform worse than even a Core 2 Duo in a lot of instances, so it doesn't perform great. I mean, look at Crysis, look at RimWorld, look at those single-threaded games. I mean, look at Black Mesa. You're looking at a situation where, yes, it'll run, and you've got 2 cores spare, but they're doing nothing. Which I suppose if you're factoring running Discord or something like that in the background or watching a video, then yes, you'd see the same performance and you can multitask, which was a huge appeal of these at the time, the multitasking aspect, which is something we do now take for granted. Then there is the little golden period, where you're talking about games like GTA 5 that perfectly utilize 4 cores and show you that, you know what? It's not a bad performing chip. You could be seeing anywhere from 40 to 60 FPS still in a game that has frankly received quite a few updates since its original 2015 launch. Yes, I know it came out on the Xbox 360 in 2013. I owned it back then. I get that comment all the time. Either way, what I'm trying to say is, it's in a weird one. It's too weak for retro gaming. I mean, it'll do it, but not as well as you want. It's got a little golden period in about 2013 to 2015, and then after that you're talking about the DirectX 12 era, where you are just seeing performance that it's a bit bad. I mean, Hitman 3 was a good example. It ran well, but that's an outlier. But there are always going to be people saying, why didn't I try emulating instruction sets? Now, you can use an Intel-provided development kit to emulate instruction sets that your processor is missing. And admittedly, in some instances, like Baldur's Gate 3, it works. You can set it as a command line to boot the game up and it will run. And we needed to do that for Baldur's Gate 3, as otherwise it just kept crashing. Honestly, I don't think it's really calling on that many instruction sets, which is why it was working. But the vast majority of games now, they are noticing you trying to emulate the instruction sets and will either promptly crash or call you out on doing it. So generally what you're seeing is, as much as people said you can still get by with these by emulating instruction sets, that might have been true 5 or 6 years ago. But now, in 2025, I tried Cyberpunk and managed to get it launched to a window. I spent over an hour on GTA 5 Enhanced Edition and made no luck there. I mean, I managed to get it to almost get in game, but it would crash. And then virtually every other title I tried that would require it, well, they just simply notice that you're trying to do it and crash when you try and launch the game. You can see it loading up in the background very slowly, but you can't get by with emulating instruction sets anymore. Maybe I'm doing it wrong, maybe there is more evidence to say that you can still get away with doing this, and if there is, please do leave a comment, because this is my first time dabbling in emulating instruction sets, and I did have a little bit of success, but it seems to me that it's just too old to manage it anymore. So after having finally done this deep dive that I've been wanting to do for a while now, it does seem like I've finally figured out the problem with the AMD Phenom. A lot of their good reputation came from that era where they became very cheap on the new market and then even cheaper on the used market with the introduction of AMD's FX chips. And you had anything up to a 6-core on these old Phenom chips that in some applications could actually outperform the AMD FX chips. But now, they seem to have lingered on that reputation, and now they aren't facing the likes of AMD's FX and used Core 2 quads and Core 2 duos on the market, because the reality is, for the same price you can pick up a system like this, well, you can quite easily go and buy an Intel system that will completely dominate this. Now, yes, you lose out on the fun of overclocking, and yes, these AMD systems are very forgiving when it comes to supporting lots of RAM and bits and pieces like that. But it's just a shame that I was expecting more. Maybe it's me that I was expecting more from a 2009 processor, but I figured 4 cores, really good clock speeds, overclocking support, but all it comes down to is that lack of instruction sets. That's all it comes down to. For general use they're fine, but they are hot, heavy and power hungry, and it's a bit of a weird one. Maybe we'll take another look at these. If people really want, there was a lot of comments saying that they are ideal for a Windows XP and Windows Vista gaming system. So maybe we'll do it properly and put Windows Longhorn on here instead. Who knows? Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and good night.